Hello and welcome to another lecture of the UiPath Bootcamp series. In the previous three lectures, we saw how to set up the UiPath Studio platform on a Windows operating system. And in the coming lectures, we'll dig deeper into this UiPath Studio and explore different activities to see how to automate different workflows. And in order to dive deeper into the UiPath Studio activities, we have taken RPA challenges as a starting point. So without wasting any time, let's have a look on the agenda. So during the course of this lecture, we'll first start by having a look at the RPA challenge itself, and we'll try and understand what the exact task is. Thereafter, we'll just get into the UiPath Studio and start the automation process. And before we start automation, we'll need to set up the Chrome browser and add an extension so that the UiPath Studio can identify different elements in the browser. So we'll have a look at this setup. Thereafter, we'll also see and understand what UI Explorer, which is a plugin within UiPath Studio, can help us in identifying different elements and the properties that comes along with these elements. Also, during the course of the automation, we would be using different Studio activities, which would mostly be pertaining to browser activities, element activities, and Excel. We'll also see how to use for loops within an automation pertaining to UiPath Studio. So, well, that's all for the agenda. So let's just go and have a look at the RPA challenge itself. All you need to do is go onto this URL. And once you're here, you would see there are different tasks that are there for the RPA challenge. In this video, we're going to focus on the input forms. And in the coming next videos, we would be focusing also on the other automations. As you can see on the left-hand side, there is a description panel where it describes what exactly the task is. And once you download this Excel file has the information of employees from a company, and you need to update this information into this input form. So let's just have a look how this Excel form looks like. As you can see that each column is directly related or is equivalent to name of different fields in the input form, and each row is the information of one of the other employee. All you need to do is go row by row into each of these this Excel file and update this into the input form and click on submit. So seems easy, right? So let's get started. Let's open our UiPath Studio and start automating. Now that we are in the UiPath Studio, let's create a new process and let's call it RPA Challenge Input Forms. All the workflows that I'll be creating in the coming videos could be accessed via Git. I will share the link in the description. And once we are here, let's launch the UI Explorer. The UI Explorer itself is nothing but like an inspector. It helps you inspect different elements in any interface. So let's see how it works. All I will do is I will use the UI Explorer to understand different properties of the elements that are there in our RPA Challenge web page. So I'll just go ahead and click on Indicate Element. You're not able to identify the different elements. You see the entire web page as one box. And this is because we have not added the UiPath extension to our Chrome browser. So let's first go ahead and add the UiPath extension. So once we are back, in order to add the extension, you need to just go to Home and click on Tools, and you would find all the extensions that are available in UiPath Studio for different browsers. For us, since we'll be automating using Chrome, I will just install this extension. You get this message wherein it says that you need to restart your browser. So let's just close this window and restart Chrome. You would find that you get a new pop-up saying Enable UiPath Studio. Since we don't get it, there's another way to add it. All you need to do is search for Chrome extension UiPath and go on this chrome.google.com and you would find the extension. All you need to do is add to Chrome and the new extension would be added to the browser. Now that this has been added, let's go to our RPA challenge page and again launch the UiPath Explorer. I would again click on the Indicate Element. And if you remember, Unlike before, now you would be able to identify each of the elements as a single entity. And now if I go ahead and click on any of these entities or these elements, you would get the property related to this element in this UI Explorer pane. And here you would see that this element that we selected has an ID and has a tag. Since it's an entry box, the tag is input. Similarly, if you hit on any other element, let's say phone number, you would again get the properties related to this particular element. In this case, since it's a label, so the tag is mentioned as label and the name is phone number. We would further use this UI Explorer in future videos. So that's why I wanted to give you a small introduction how to use the Explorer. And now let's go back to our RPA challenge page. If you remember, the core activity here is we need to take data from an Excel file and input data in this form. So for that, first open your main workflow, and under UI automation, you would find an element, and under element, there is this type into activity. All you need to do is drag and drop this in the center, and you need to give the data or the text that you want to type into the box. And always remember to use double quotes. Since it's a text, it has to be there in double quotes. And let's give in abc@gmail.com. Let's say that's the email ID. And now we need to identify the element where this ID has to be entered. So let's click on indicate on screen, and the web page would open. And since we need to enter this data in this input box, we'll select this input box. And again, if you see this three lines, if you click here, you have an option to open the UI Explorer from here also, as well as you can also edit the selector that you have just selected. So if I click on this edit selector, you would get the same ID and the tag that we had seen before. So just click on OK, or you can also use this highlight button and it will highlight which ID has been selected or has been selected in this input activity. And now if I run this sequence, the data or the email ID would be entered in the web page. As you can see, this has been entered. Just note this one point, that the ID related to the email box was UVTFM. And now let's just go and refresh this page. If you see that the email box has now been moved to a different location, and if I try to run this again, this would not work. As you can see that there is an error message wherein it says that it was unable to find this particular element. So let's try and repair again and see why it did not work. And if I go into the edit selector and again click on the indicate element and select my email box, you see the ID got changed to IRD6Z. This means the ID related to the email is not stable and it keeps changing with every refresh of the web page. So in this case, we would not be able to use this type into activity, and we need to use a different activities that is called Anchor Base. And you would find that inside Find and just drag and drop the Anchor Base. So Anchor Base is basically an activity that would help you when you have to deal with unreliable elements. So in our case, since the entry box is unreliable and it keeps changing with every refresh of the browser, so we need to find a reliable element on the web page, which we can use as a reference to identify these unreliable elements. So in our case, if you see, the labels that are attached to every entry box are basically not changing even when we refresh the page. It's only that the position keeps changing, but the name itself remains the same. So we would be using the labels of different entry boxes as an identifier or as a reference, or also called the anchor, to identify the other elements. So let's go ahead and see how to do that. All you need to do is click on Find Element and drag and drop here in the anchor position. And let's indicate this anchor element. In our case, let's just take email. So email for us is the anchor. And now we need to drop the activity that we want to do with the entry box. So since we would be typing the email address. So let's drag and drop the type into activity and again indicate this as well on the screen. Having done that, type in the email and then let's just go and run it. And it's working. And now if I go back and refresh this page and rerun my workflow, I would still be able to identify my email. As you can see that it's working, and irrespective of me refreshing the browser, the elements are still being identified. We have used the anchor base to identify the email element, but it's not enough. We need to also do the same thing for the other entry boxes in our browser. And instead of copy pasting this anchor base 6 or 7 times, what we can do is we can run through a for loop and we can go through each of these elements and do it through this iteration. But before we do that, let's create our variable through which we want to iterate. And let's call this variable as entry item list. Since it's going to be an array, so we would select the variable type as array, and it's going to be an array of strings. So let's just select string. Now the question is, what should be the default value of this array? As you know, we have to iterate through different entry elements that are there on the browser or on the web page. So we will use the label name as single elements of our array. So let's go ahead and name it. Don't forget the double quote since it's string. For now, I would just keep these three, and then we can update the list later on. Now that we have our array, what we need to do is search for an for loop activity. Just go here and for each and drag and drop it here. Once that's done, we need to move our anchor base inside the body of the for each. Since we've already defined the variable for the item list, I'm just going to go ahead and type it in here. And you would get a suggestion from UiPath directly. All you need to do is just hit on enter and it will be selected. Now the for loop would run 3 times because in our variable we have 3 variables or 3 string item, and each time in each loop the item variable would be updated with one of these strings. There's still one thing left. If you have a look at the anchor, it is pointing to email element, and we need to change this into a dynamic selector. And in order to do that, all you need to do is just click on this, and on the right hand side you will have the selector element. You need to replace the email with the variable. So for us, in this case, the variable is item. There's a bit of .NET coding here, which I will just share in a few minutes. Now we have replaced the hard-coded email with our variable here, which is nothing but item that we got from a for loop. Now if we try and run the workflow, then all the 3 entry boxes, namely the last name, email, and first name, would be updated with abc@gmail.com. Let's run it. If you see, the last name, the email, and the first name has been updated. And in the next step, we would replace this text also with a variable. And in order to do that, we need to now start looking into the Excel file. And from this Excel file, we'll be getting different data for different employees. If you've not already downloaded the Excel file, just go on the RPA Challenge page and download the Excel file. Since I've already done that and saved it in my project folder, I would just go back to the UiPath Studio and try to read this Excel file. Now from here, there are 2 ways that you could read the Excel file. In the first case, it could happen that you have Microsoft Excel installed on your system. In that case, you could directly use the activities from app integration. And if not, then you can use the system activities in UiPath Studio. One benefit of the app integration is that there are multiple activities that can be directly used. But then there are also cases that you don't have an Microsoft Excel installed on your system, and you still want to work with these Excel activities, then you need to use the system activities. So in order to read the Excel file, the very first activity that we need to do or we need to work on is the read range activity. And if you see here, there are two, and if you see here, the read range activity is available under app integration as well as under system activities. Since I don't have Excel installed on my system, I would be using system activities to read range of an Excel file. So let's just drag and drop it here. And as you can see, you need to enter the path of the workbook. And so that, let's just go into our project folder and copy the full path of this Excel file and paste it here. And as a next step, we need to give the sheet name inside the workbook from where we want to grab the data. So in our Excel file here, the name of the sheet is also sheet 1. So we don't need to change the sheet name here. And then we need to give the range where we want to capture the data from. So in our Excel file, it is from A1 till G11. So let's specify this range. If you leave the range as empty, then it would read the entire sheet. But since in our case, we already know the range, so let's give it A1 to J11. So since we have not yet defined which data table it's going to save it into, so let's go inside the property panel here. And you can see under output, we have a data table option. So we need to create a variable here. As we had already seen that you can create a variable from the variable panel, but there's also an option to create a variable directly into the property panel. All you need to do is click on a shortcut that is Control K, and then you can specify the name of the variable. So in our case, it's employee data table. And the moment you press enter, you can see in our variable panel, a new variable has been added. And the variable type has been updated automatically since it was a data table type. So now that we have a variable, data table, let's make sure that we are reading the right data. And for that, you need to convert your data table into a string variable. So let's look for the activity that does that, and it's called output data table. So let's drag and drop it here in the center. And in the input, we need to specify the data table that we want to convert to string. And it's nothing but our employee DT. And again, here we need to create a variable since it's not there already. And as you click enter, you see the new variable has been added to our variable panel. Now that we have converted, or now that we have saved the data table into a string, we need to now print it somehow. So let's go ahead and use the message box activity to print the data table as a string. And we need to give here the name of the variable, which is nothing but the employee DT output. So now let's run this file. This should read our Excel file and print a message box with all the data in the Excel. Now let's move on to the next step, where we need to iterate through this data table and access the data corresponding to each employee. For that, all you need to do is go into your activity panel and type data table. And UiPath already has a bunch of activities that you could use for your data tables. And in this case, we'll be using for each. Just drag and drop it here. And since we want to iterate through our data table, which is called employee DT, we'll just give it in here. And the variable that would be created is known as row. I will again use this message box to check if we are able to iterate correctly through each of these rows. And I would again give in the row variable. As I said, this is an object and it has certain attributes. So the moment you type dot, you would be seeing all the attributes and functions related to this object. Since we want to print the items, I will use the item attribute. And in this case, you could either give the column number, and if you know the column name, you can also give the column name here. Since you already know the different column names, I would just go ahead and write a column name. Let's say last name, for instance. And Since the message box accepts only strings as a variable, we need to convert this item into a string. Now that it's done, let's try and run it. And we should be able to see the last name corresponding to each row. So since the first row is Smith, and in the second row should be Dorsey and Kipling, and so on. So we have been able to successfully access each row and also a particular column name within each row. But we just don't want one column name. We want to access each and every column. For example, the last name, the first name, the role in the company, and all of these column names. For that, we need to insert another for each loop. And for that, just type in for each and drag and drop it within the body. But this time, since we want to loop through the column names, we would be using the employee DT data table. The employee DT data table itself is an object and it also has certain attributes. And in this case, we'd be using the column attribute and we would be iterating through each of these column names. And again, we would just move this message box into the body. And instead of the last name, we would replace it with our column variable, which is nothing but item. So now if we try and run it, we would be iterating not only through a row, but also different columns. And you should, since right now we are in the first row, and in the first row, the second item is company name. So you should get IT Solutions and then John, then Analyst and 98 odd, and so on. So for now, I would just stop this workflow. Now that we are able to read each row and column inside the data table, it's time to go back to our anchor base and update the variables there. So let's do some cleaning before we go there. Let's remove the activities that you don't need. And let's reactivate this command. For that, just press on Control E. And we need this anchor base activity. So I will just cut it and paste it inside our for loops body here. So we have our anchor base here. And we don't need the for loop here anymore. So I will just delete it. So if you remember, we have already converted the static selector into a dynamic one by replacing the email label to the item variable. One thing that wasn't working was we were giving this hard-coded mail address into every entry box. So this thing we'll be replacing with the item that we have from here. And I would again delete this as well. So let's try and run this loop. Now, as you can see, we are iterating through each row and the data is being updated into each of these entry boxes. And since we are not submitting this form and the page is not being refreshed, with every new iteration, the data is being just added to the same field again and again. So let's go ahead and fix this problem by adding the submit button also in this automation. Now, in order to add the click activity to the workflow, just go into the activity panel and search for click activity and drag and drop it inside the for loop. Since we want to do the submit activity for every employee, that means for every row, we would be adding it into the outer for loop. So once that's done, we need to indicate the element on the screen. And in this case, it's the submit button. And also, if you see here on the RPA challenge page, we have a start button. So in order to start the challenge, we need to click on the start button. So let's integrate another click activity. And this should be positioned in the beginning of all the activities. And again, we need to indicate the start button, which is this. So let's try and run this automation again. And unlike before, we would be submitting this form and updating this web page with every new iteration. So if you see here, once the form is being submitted, there's a new form that appears and the data is being updated in this new form. As you remember, the browser was always open and we did that manually. We need to integrate this part as well. And in order to do that, let's just go back to our UiPath Studio and search for browser activity. And for us, we would be using open browser. And here you need to type in the URL of the browser. That is, for us, it is nothing but rpachallenge.com. Once that's done, we need to also identify the kind of browser that we'd be using. In this case, it's Chrome. And if you see, we are getting an error because we forgot the double quotes. So let's fix this. So once that's done, we'll just delete this do sequence here and copy paste the sequence that we just created. So let's just cut it and paste it inside the open browser activity. So once that's done, let's try and rerun it. And at this point, it should also be able to open the browser on its own. Now that everything is running, let's do some refactoring and cleaning of this code. This is also one of the best practices that most of the developers follow. And it's nothing but we will be renaming each of these UiPath Studio activities depending on the function that they actually do. So for example, here, instead of using the click button, we will replace the button with start, since we are clicking start button, and so on. I'm just going to go ahead and update each of these activities. There are mainly two major reasons why we want to do this. The very first reason is that your code becomes more readable, and in case if you're sharing this file with someone else, he would exactly understand what that particular activity is made for. Also, in the debug mode, whenever you receive an error, it will also indicate on which sequence or which activity that error is coming from. So if you don't update these activities with your custom names, you might get confused when the error comes from a similar activity, and you would not know where to start from. For example, in your workflow, there could be two sequences, and since the name for both these sequences would be a sequence, you would not be able to identify that the error is coming from which of these sequences. So as a thumb of rule, just go ahead and update these activities with your custom names so that they also represent the function that they're carrying out. So now that everything is done, let's do a quick recap. So in this workflow, we started with creating an anchor base. And once we created this anchor base, we read the Excel file, and then we started iterating through this Excel file in order to access the employee data for each of these employees of a company. And then once iterating through the rows, we also iterated through each column so that we also get the attributes corresponding to each employee. And then this attribute was then, using the anchor base, was entered into the RPA challenge page. And once that was done, we added the click activities, that is the start button and the submit button as well. And in the end, we added the open browser activity in order to open the browser automatically. So in this entire workflow, the development methodology that we followed was a bottom-up approach. So this could be one of the ways that you could start with an automation, to start with the smallest element and then keep on adding different layers of development on top. Well, that's all for this video. And in the next video, we'll look into another RPA challenge. I hope you like my approach, and if these videos are adding value to your automation skills, then give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to hit on the subscribe button. So see you again in the next video, and until then, keep safe and keep healthy. Bye-bye.